Right, so it's been delightful over the last 4.5 years to work with a group of engineers and social scientists in understanding infrastructure. And I should highlight the interdependencies and the mutual learning between the social sciences and engineering that's at the core of the iBUILD project. So what I want to do in this presentation is talk a little bit about something slightly different, financing and funding infrastructure, which I'm sure you haven't heard much about this morning. But this is financing and funding with a slightly different twist. So the key challenge, or the key citizen challenge, the policy challenge, how do we fund and finance local infrastructure in places with limited demand or in which provision is too expensive? So not talking about central London, where it's easy to put in place infrastructure. We're talking about marginal places. We hear too much about Manchester, Leeds, London and Newcastle. What about Evesham, Perthshire and Giggleswick? All of these smaller places in which there isn't the demand for infrastructure. So what we need is have a much more balanced political debate, especially as we're moving into a new environment where London becomes perhaps less important as financial services begin to restructure and other places have to become slightly more important. Now, there are many ways in which infrastructure is funded. So we can talk about conventional business models or alternative business models, and these are well known. Taxation, user fees, various forms of public funding, various forms of private sector funding, various forms of financialization. And these we can identify over the last 200 years, standard business models that have been developed in various places across the world to develop financing and funding solutions. We then have additional. Now, additional involve complex combinations of user inputs, providing in some cases, end-user innovation, so the users are innovating. So these are amateur engineers that are producing new ways of constructing and delivering infrastructure. We hear very little about those types of infrastructure. Now, these are additional because in the places where we have these additional, there is no alternative. You either have no infrastructure provision or you do it yourself. And that becomes a really critically important point. London, easy to get your infrastructure. Birmingham, okay, as long as it's not high-speed broadband, and then you've got a slight problem because it's easier to get it at home than in one of the commercial buildings in downtown Birmingham. So what we need to do is think about the different ways, the heterogeneity in which infrastructure is financed and funded. So financialization. We know an awful lot about financialization, where infrastructure becomes an asset class, and all we're interested in is risk and expected yield. But the key thing with the financialization debate over infrastructure is the question that no one asks, and that is what is precisely being financialized? Who's gaining, who's losing, what are the impacts? So that question is what is being financialized is pretty important. So if we look at one particular example of Birmingham. So Birmingham, the first city outside London is one definition, a city with major problems that are so big that if they were solved, they would be seen on the UK's national accounts. Interesting issues in terms of a court case in which the City Council lost over unequal pay between men and women. It ended up with a liability of £600 million and it began to sell off assets. But what did it sell? It sold leaseholds, it retained the development rights. It was doing precisely what a clever local authority should be doing. It was maintaining the long-term value of the assets. So the National Exhibition Centre was sold, an investment not within Birmingham, because it was built outside Birmingham's administrative area. What they sold was only a leasehold interest. The development rights retained with the city. So within iBUILD, we've developed a concept called the financialization fix. Now, this is a very different form of financialization, because what a financialization fix is, it's an engineering solution. So we bring our engineering colleagues into financialization, which is combined with a financial model. Now, every single engineered infrastructure on the ground is unique, it's different, it's special, it's a specialist project. So we have a specialist engineering solution, occasionally with a conventional business model attached to it. And rarely do we have something which is alternative, additional, or innovative, or creative. Because in the world of classical conventional finance, there's usually nothing new, mainly because financiers want to avoid risk. Newness leads to increased exposure to risk and liability. Now, there are different forms of financialization fix. So one of the things we've been doing in iBUILD is undertaking a comparative analysis of the London Underground versus the Hong Kong Metro. Now, if you look at the London Underground, it was financialized as soon as it was being dug It was a private sector initiative, primarily financialised, but the most interesting line in the London Underground was the Metropolitan line. So like the Northern Line extension, a really interesting business model based on land value capture, but land value capture in 1860, not 2018. And that land value capture meant that the development rights that were going on within London Metropolitan's Underground, they were generating more profit than they were generating from running the railway. So the Baker Street development, constructed in 1925, capital costs of 500,000, but the rate of return was much higher than they were making on that particular line. Now, when that line was nationalised and brought into London Underground, the first thing that happened was that novel, innovative business model in which land value was being captured to support the railway was removed and replaced with a standard public sector approach to financing the London Underground. And it's only in recent years where London Underground is busy trying to retrofit little bits of land value capture into the system. And like Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Metro is a long-term sustainable business model because land value capture is written into that business model from day one. So you don't need to have additional inputs of public sector funding to support Hong Kong's metro. It's all coming from the ways in which the metro system is capitalizing on the escalations in land values linked to that particular system. Now, the additional business models play a critical role within iBUILD. And this notion of additionality comes from a well-known social science book, The End of Capitalism, a very difficult book. What this book argues is that non-capitalist relationships are critically important, but they are invisible. They're marginalized in our discourses, they're marginalized by politicians, they're being marginalized and become relatively invisible within academic debate. But within the world of local infrastructure, we find lots of non-capitalist relationships going on, lots of additional business models. So we can think about DIY and local infrastructure fixes. If you live in Detroit and you want public services, you're not going to get them because of a failure within Detroit's city business model, so you do it yourself. So if you want to read about DIY Detroit, go onto an online bookseller and buy the book, because there's a very big book that came out 2 years ago on all the DIY activities that citizens within Detroit have to do because local infrastructure isn't there. In Birmingham, last summer, we had a well-known problem with bins. One bit of the city had no difficulty because the citizens had already established a group that's been running for 25 years. They set up their own alternative bin collection system. Why wouldn't they do that? Why do you want the rubbish piling up on the street? It's their streets, they take control, they take ownership. So we have self-help and local infrastructure, and then we have this notion of citizen innovation. So innovation doesn't always have to come from the state, it doesn't always have to come from the private sector, it can come from the individual amateur citizen engineer. And a lot of the developments and innovations that support infrastructure came from amateur engineers. Go to all of the engineering royal societies and look at the famous names. They weren't university professors. These were people with very different career profiles. So if we look at one particular type of infrastructure, and it's a very modern infrastructure, broadband, major problems with access to broadband. Visit Birmingham and experience our broadband speed. But in other parts of the UK, you can't get it. So what do? Well, you either just put your hands up and say, we can't get it. We live here, we like it, we like our spherical cows we're living beside, because we're out in the countryside. But in many cases, communities band together and they develop novel additional business models. And within our analysis, we've identified 15 of these, 15 communities setting up their own broadband provision system. And a very interesting one were the Church of England in 2 dioceses in which you have relatively flat land topography. They're using church towers to partly fund churches and also to provide access to broadband to isolated rural farmers who need to fill in all of their forms for central government and for Brussels. Now, how these additional business models operate is you have a standard conventional business model running in the center of this diagram. So a gap is identified, someone needs to produce some leadership. There's a value network developed of individuals, companies, organizations, flows of finance and funding, and something is put together as a project. But within these citizen-based broadband networks, what we have is volunteer time. So the managers, the leadership, the people digging the trenches, the people laying the cable, these are volunteers. Access to land, the various accesses one needs is free. the farmers are providing access to free equipment, and you end up putting in place a broadband system that ultimately, through user charges, is able to employ someone to manage that particular system. Now, for these communities, there is no alternative. You either do this as an additional form of provision, or you have no broadband, or you go and live in central London or central Birmingham. There are many different ways, many examples, and if you go onto the iBUILD website, you will see 40 or 50 different examples of additional ways in which people come together to produce novel forms of local infrastructure business model that doesn't involve anything to do with financialization, mainstream finance, pension fund investment, or whatever. The key blockages are the public sector saying you can't do this because this is not your responsibility, it's not your set of skills, you don't have the set of expertise, you don't have the right liabilities in terms of insurance cover, don't do it, and because you can't do it, you do nothing. Now, there is another example, which is an example of innovative street lighting. Now, there are some parts of the world where electricity is yet to come in terms of street lighting. So this is the Malvern Hills, where the gas lighting is still there as an attractive part of the streetscape. Every couple of years, the local authority decides, isn't it time that they modernized and adopted electric lighting? And that debate is usually about cost, because running these gas lights provides an additional 30,000 a year cost to the local authority's lighting. And for some people, they think the lighting isn't that great. So 3 or 4 years ago, that debate began again. Let's get rid of the gas lighting. And a local individual said, well, wait a minute, we can re-engineer the gas lights so we get more illumination, they consume less gas, and we can produce a novel engineering innovation that's new to the planet, and we can apply this to Malvern's gas lights. Malvern Hills Council said, no, this isn't your responsibility. This individual then went to the transition group of Malvern Hills, and as a group, they persuaded the local authority to adopt their approach. And the outcome of this is end-user citizen innovation produces an engineering solution that maintains an existing heritage local infrastructure. Now, the reason why Malvern Hills gas lighting is important is because the gas light, or the street light in C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories, that light in the wood, is a Malvern light. So there's a heritage link, which is important for Malvern and for tourism, and it's important for the quality of place, that you have local distinctiveness and difference. Now, there is a recent innovation with Malvern's street lighting, which represents another engineering solution, and it's not a novel solution, but it is a Malvern solution. So the Malvern Hills is an area packed full of dog walkers, producing lots of interesting bags full of substance. Now, these are either placed decoratively in trees or hedgerows, or occasionally in the bins provided by the local authority, which the local authority has to collect them. So here, an amateur engineer has connected a biodigester to a gas light, and what you do is you take your dog for your walk, you pick up a plastic bag, you deposit what the dog has produced in that plastic bag, you place it in a slot, you turn a handle, and the biodigester produces methane, which produces a sustainable gas light. Now, those of you who are engineers will know that this is not novel, because across London there are street lights that are illuminated by gas, and they're linked to the sewage system, and they're used there to remove some of the more dangerous gases which are burnt off through that lighting system. Go to Sheffield, there are 40 such lights. In London, there are 3 remaining. In Malvern, we're getting this novel lighting from a sustainable source coming from dog fouling. Now, what is this? It's an example of end-user innovation. It's a novel business model that might be adopted by Malvern Hills. It's a different way of doing things. So what does this suggest? It means, first thing is, local infrastructure, it's heterogeneous. There's great complexity in funding and finance, and also great simplicity, because most of it is paid by taxpayers, most of it is direct or indirect taxation, some of it is user fees, some of that then becomes converted into financialized products, but as a user, you tend not to see much of that. That's all behind the scenes. So it's not just about financialization, or a local infrastructure debate shouldn't be just about financialization. Now, what we need to accept is this shift or move towards financialization is not new. So the London Underground would not exist unless we had it financialised in the 1840s, because it was purely private sector investment. And it's also worth noting that those who invested in the London Underground made very little. They usually lost money because of the economics didn't stack up unless you were investing in that line that was using land value capture. So funding and finance and investment returns coming from a slightly different part of the infrastructure business model. Now, DIY solutions, you might argue these are trivial, they're minor, so having a local broadband system in a small village or in a rural area, how important is that? Well, for the people living in that place, it's critically important. For the people who are passionate about Malvern Hills and its gas lights, it's critically important. And if you're not doing it in Detroit and providing DIY solutions, you're not going to have any public service solution. So the additional local infrastructure engineering solution business models produce potential possibilities for things that might be scaled up and rolled out. So we shouldn't forget or ignore the role of the amateur engineer. So what we tried to do in this presentation and within iBUILD is actually break down the boundaries between a discussion about engineering and technological innovation and a discussion about social science and economics and business models. And sometimes we've succeeded and sometimes we've failed, but as we've seen from the last presentation, we've managed to convert an engineer into someone who can speak relatively sensibly about economics.